This week on Dialogue, an update from Ukraine. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Now let's meet our guests. Blair Ruble is director of the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies at the Wilson Center, where he also serves as director of Comparative Urban Studies. Mark Medish is a former senior staff member of the National Security Council who currently serves as executive vice president of APCO Worldwide, where he runs its executive service global political strategies. He joined APCO after serving as a visiting scholar and senior advisor at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us. I want to begin with a little bit of a travelogue, Blair. You recently were in Ukraine, and you came back a bit discouraged about some things that you observed. Can you give us an overview of what you saw and what your thinking is currently?
Yes, I happened to be in Ukraine when former Prime Minister Tymoshenko was sentenced to 7 years in prison. And I was there. We have an office and we work with scholars and talking to people. I think there's a sense that Ukraine's opportunity for democracy is slipping away. And I think the Tymoshenko case exemplifies some deeper structural problems in Ukraine, and they're now all out in the open. They can't be papered over anymore.
Let's dig deeper into that. Is the Tymoshenko case the tip of the iceberg in this regard? Is the slippage away from democracy much deeper?
I think there's a structural problem that is shared with all post-Soviet states, but it's now particularly acute in Ukraine. You know, if you go back, what was the source of wealth in these societies? It was wealth that was owned by the state. Mm-hmm. So politics wasn't about ideology. Politics wasn't about nationalism. Politics became a means by which members of the elite could enrich themselves. And what we see happening is a continuing battle over the redistribution of what was once state property. And therefore, a lot of issues that would matter and most other parts of the world don't matter at all. And we see this pattern developing in many, many countries. It had seemed as if Ukraine was somewhat exempt from it, but the new government seems to be intent on exerting monopoly control for itself over the goods of the system.
Mark, what went wrong? This is the scene of the Orange Revolution that indicated a different momentum.
Well, I'd like to start by taking a step back on the 20th anniversary of Ukrainian independence, just to say that I remain an optimist about Ukraine's future. I think the country has enormous potential, large market that should be in Europe, can grow closer to Europe, well-educated people, many resources. But your question's a very good one. What has gone wrong? Why the speed bumps? And I do agree with Blair's assessment of the present challenges. Part of it is growing pains. Ukraine is still a young country in terms of governance and its political system. But I must say that the trends right now are quite worrisome because this is a period in which so many countries in the world face strategic challenges and need strategic leadership, and we just don't see that clearly in Ukraine right now. And I'm worried that it could be a great missed opportunity for the country.
Does that, at the risk of sounding overly cynical, does that distinguish Ukraine from a lot of other countries right now, this lack of strategic leadership? This is a criticism you hear around the globe right now.
Yes, and I think we all have to approach this with a degree of humility. We have challenges in our country, in the United States. Europe obviously faces deep challenges. Ukraine's neighbors face deep challenges, but that puts a special burden on leadership today. And if I were a Ukrainian citizen, I would probably be quite frustrated about the lack of vision and the lack of clear direction. Wasting these years would be a tragedy for Ukraine. This is the time for a much more concerted effort by the political class to implement reforms that have been long delayed.
Are there other leaders waiting in the wings? Are there voices of hope?
Well, this is, I think, one of the challenges for Ukraine. You had a generation of post-Soviet leaders who have. You've had two waves of post-Soviet leaders, sort of the original founders of Ukrainian state, and then you had the participants in the Orange Revolution, President Yushchenko, Prime Minister Tymoshenko, President Yanukovych, and those three political figures really took most of the oxygen out of the political system. And as one looks around, part of the problem is you don't really see a viable alternative to the people in power at this moment.
They were just such large figures that...
There were large figures who were struggling with each other constantly, and they occupied the space. And none of the three of them really encouraged the development of a new cohort of leaders. So right now, there are a couple of potential figures around, but no one looks as if he or she can really challenge those in power.
If I could add a point, that I think the particular challenge for countries that are in transition, emerging markets like Ukraine, a country that could be among the next BRICS, the next leading emerging markets in the world, the danger is that the leadership should take the wrong lesson from the troubles in the West today. A very myopic view would be that, well, the pressure is off. Europe and the United States are having their financial problems, their governance problems, and that means we can relax. And it's quite the contrary. This is the time to dig deeper. And I'm afraid that's
while the competition is down, this is an opportunity to make your move? Is that essentially what you're saying?
Absolutely. And the competition is only going to get more intense. If Ukraine seriously aspires to join that group of leading emerging market countries, this is the time to invest in the country.
But Mark, I think one of the problems is that this leadership isn't interested in playing that game at all. And I think what we see is a leadership that is much more intent on plundering the wealth that exists than encouraging the creation of new wealth. And I think that is the problem.
Is it that corrupt? What you're describing is, just a sort of an old model of somebody there just to exploit the nation's.
There's a very recent, very small example that actually becomes rather personal because it happened when one of the protagonists was here speaking at the Kennan Institute. But there was Ivan Malkovich is a famous Ukrainian
poet,
and he set up a really wonderful children's publishing house. And while he was here, somebody wanted to have his publishing house's offices, and they broke a hole through the floor and started occupying.
So while he was out of the country,
right? They moved in, and now after a lot of yelling and screaming and so on and so forth, pushing back and forth, the occupation has kind of ceased. But this is not an unusual pattern. We had an office in Kiev that was occupied by somebody who wanted it 10 years ago. And elementary rights to property are not honored. And it's really survival of the fittest.
So this isn't an anomaly. There is a larger problem.
No. I mean, again, I now have personal experiences with two examples of this, and I'm not that deeply involved in Ukraine.
I want to rewind a bit, go back to Tymoshenko. What was the rationale for her imprisonment? Why was she arrested?
She was arrested in violation of a law that was a Stalin-era law that was revised in the 60s. And it had to do with economic crimes against the state. And the charge was that she negotiated, as I understand it, she negotiated an agreement over gas supplies with the Russians, with Prime Minister Putin, that was not the best deal that she could have gotten. So,
so for striking a bad deal.
Right. And she's a very complex, problematic figure. It is conceivable that there may have been other charges that could have been brought against her in a rule of law system, but this is really just a sham.
You think it's all politically motivated?
there seems to be no evidence that it's anything but
Viktor
politically motivated.
Yushchenko told the BBC he didn't believe it was politically motivated. What is that all about?
Well,
I suspect his comment is politically motivated.
I suspected that when I asked the question, but I wanted to hear from the experts.
But frankly, I think we're as Blair suggests, we're witnessing the criminalization of political differences, which is a recipe for paralysis and worse.
Well, isn't it also a huge barrier to what you talked about, the economic potential of the country?
Of course it is. Of course it is.
So what has been the international reaction to this from other leaders, from the EU, from the United States?
Well, it's been quite sharp. Mr. Yanukovych had to cancel an expected trip to the EU after the EU expressed its grave concern about these developments, and so I think Ukraine is experiencing a form of probation. Right now.
And does the EU and other critics, do they have leverage with Ukraine?
Go ahead. The EU might have more, well, it certainly has more leverage than we do. We don't seem to have much leverage at all. But it has been a stated goal of Ukrainian policy to move into partnership with the EU. And part of the good news of the Ukrainian story is the way in which the legal system is step by step being brought into alignment with EU norms. And there is an orientation which all Ukrainian politicians at this point at least verbally accept, which is Ukraine's economic future is with the EU. Now, this runs up against other claims from the Russians, but in this case, Yanukovych has managed to anger everyone because Tymoshenko was convicted of signing an agreement with Putin. So this is, by implication, is making Putin a criminal as well. And so he's managed to get the U.S., the EU, and the Russians all mad at him.
What is the likelihood that this president backs down on this decision?
It doesn't seem to be. There doesn't seem to be much likelihood.
It's always a tough thing to do in politics, is to turn.
They seem to be wanting to pile on more charges.
Let's slightly shift gears. This is clearly critical, but let's focus on the economy. Congressman Michael Grimm this week, I think, called it one of the 5 most promising economies on the planet. So talk to us about what are the strengths of Ukraine? Why is it viewed as such fertile ground for development?
Well, fertile ground is a very apt phrase because it's the breadbasket of Europe, and that remains the case today. I mean, it's amazingly rich agricultural land. It has a strong manufacturing base also in the eastern parts of the country. It has human capital, well-educated workforce. The location is fantastic. It's a crossroads of Eurasia. It sits between Russia and Turkey, and I mean, you couldn't ask for more. So I agree with the congressman's sentiment, but the impediments are, as Blair suggested, that the direction of the present leadership seems to undermine Ukraine's chances of breaking out, of having a breakthrough. And that's of grave concern. It appears the signal has gone out that the government wants to promote the redistribution of assets among controlling economic syndicates in the country, and that's the main game in town. So in short, what Ukraine is not doing is promoting organic growth from the grassroots.
Blair, how does this, the point you brought up earlier about a lack of respect for property as it related to office space, how does this transfer over to this discussion of agriculture and land ownership? Well,
land ownership is a critical issue, and basically at no point is somebody's right to a particular piece of property fixed. And Ukraine was making considerable progress towards opening up its agricultural markets, towards involving the international investors in developing agriculture. As elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, agriculture needs a lot of investment to modernize it. And there's money to be made off of agriculture in Ukraine. But basically what's happened is there was an embargo on exports that was put on, which is absolutely insane. There's been an effort to take away opportunities for international investment in Ukrainian agriculture. It's not even a question of nationalism. It's literally turning those assets over to the control of people around the president. It would be one thing if we were going to have another debate about who should own land. Should it be foreigners or should it be Ukrainians? But this is really about a small group of people in power.
We talked about the implications for Vladimir Putin as far as if you just follow the logic, if he were in Ukraine, he'd be in jail for the same deal. So what does this say about relations between Ukraine and Russia? And also, if you would expand that to talk about Ukrainian relations with its other regional neighbors.
Well, go ahead.
You're speaking? Well, I think Ukraine and Russia have a complex relationship. It is a long-term relationship. The notion that either one of them is going to radically change the complexion of its attitude to the other is naive. These are countries and peoples bound together closely by geography, by history, by demography, by language, by culture. I think that we're seeing a rather contentious period in the political relationship between the two countries. There's no question that Mrs. Tymoshenko, fairly or unfairly, was viewed as more of a friendly interlocutor with Moscow. And this is one of the reasons I think she's been persecuted and prosecuted. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot of signs that Moscow and Kiev are trying to balance the relationship, steady the boat. Again, because they have such long-term interests.
What would they need to do to steady the boat? Where's the instability?
Well, I think the problem begins with profound emotions on both sides.
It's personal.
It's personal. It's personal because many Ukrainians and Russians have deep family connections with one another. It's personal because they were all part of the political elites were part of a joint elite at one point. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the problems in the relationship is really managing the emotions and trying to elevate pragmatic decision-making over emotions. And I think for President Putin, I think it's been, and for many Russians, it's very difficult to accept an independent Ukraine. Psychologically, they may, I don't think anybody seriously is talking about refighting those battles, but that doesn't mean that just because you're saying you're accepting a boundary doesn't mean that emotionally
a generational limitation.
I think it goes, but I think Mark's point is correct. It goes beyond a generation.
Deeper than that.
It's deeper than that, and therefore what has to happen is that this is a relationship that has to be managed over time.
I think it's the Nord Stream pipeline, the natural gas pipeline. What is the impact of that? Because if I understand it correctly, that could cost Ukraine a lot of money.
Absolutely.
So what does this add to this contentious period that you just described between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, it raises the risk that the Ukrainian government may miscalculate its own degree of leverage in the energy relationship with Russia. In other words, its leverage as a transit country. Mm-hmm. And it seems that Russia has approached this issue strategically over a number of years. The time required to invest in these new pipelines that bypass Ukraine. South Stream is another pathway through the Black Sea to the European markets, and Ukraine needs to think twice about this. Ukraine's fundamental problem is that it consumes energy as though it were still part of the Soviet Union. Mm. That can't be in its national interest. Mm. Very simply put.
Let's talk militarily, strategically in that regard. What is Ukraine a future NATO member? Where does Ukraine's future lie in this regard?
Well, I think there had been some. I think there had been some encouragement to Ukraine to think of itself as a NATO partner, but I think that's off the table at the moment.
With the new president, or what?
Well, it's off the table. It was off the table before the new president. It's off the table because until and unless you have a reliable Ukrainian state, why would Europeans and North Americans and NATO members sign an agreement that makes the future of Ukraine your future? Mm-hmm. And I think this is the part that the Ukrainians don't really understand. There had been a lot of promises about NATO. There had been, among the Ukrainian elite, it's a contentious issue in Ukraine, but among the Ukrainian elite, there were a lot of Ukrainians who thought that they had a NATO card to play. And yet, precisely the kind of behavior we're talking about makes it inconceivable that the American voter or the French voter or the German voter is going to be happy signing an agreement which basically means that we will defend Ukraine. And this is the short-sightedness of current Ukrainian behavior. It goes back to partnership with the EU. It goes back to the oil and gas relationships with Russia. There's an attitude that we have a good game, we're going to keep it going, and everybody needs Ukraine. And what's happening is the world is evolving in a way that everybody doesn't need Ukraine.
What are the most relevant national security issues for Ukraine?
Well, I think they're what we've mentioned. One is, of course, maintaining independence. That's of vital importance. How do you do that? You do that by promoting economic dynamism and economic vitality, reducing reliance on.
So it's soft power over hard power in this regard.
Yes, and it's that's the long-term insurance policy. It's the only one that really counts. And I do agree with Blair that from the standpoint of Washington and some European capitals, I think we put an undue emphasis on NATO membership for Ukraine as some kind of a silver bullet or panacea. In any bilateral relationship, we have limited diplomatic and political resources to bring to bear. And in much of the last decade, we put a huge emphasis on NATO membership to the exclusion of other forms of integration, which I think would have aided Ukraine much more for the long term. Economic forms of integration, for example. And I think that was a bit of a strategic blunder, frankly. But the question is Ukraine's interests, and here the burden is on the Ukrainian leadership to identify its own priorities and act on them.
Mm-hmm. Blair, what could you tell us about the public mood? Mark mentioned that if he were a Ukrainian, he'd be a little frustrated these days.
Oh, I think frustration is the mood. I think there's a sourness. As someone, you mentioned, I was in Kiev. Somebody mentioned to me, "Don't forget, half the people in Ukraine didn't vote for this government, and don't support this government." According to public opinion polls, approval ratings for the government is down in the 20%. But there's a sense that there aren't really any options. The party in power has the ability to change the Constitution, there will be a new election law, which I think is beginning to look as if it will make it more and more difficult for opposition parties to exist. And so I think on the one hand, the frustration is both anger and disappointment with what's going on and an inability to see a way of influencing what's going on because the people in power really don't care.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the new election law. I'm going to ask both of you to weigh in on observers of this, whether optimistic or pessimistic. What are some upcoming events, checkpoints, things you'll be looking at, developments that we should keep our eye on to give us a sense of how things are trending?
Well, I think seeing what the new election law is next spring, seeing how much room it allows for other parties. I think what happens to Tymoshenko is a very important bellwether. Whether or not there are other members of previous governments who come under threat of prosecution. And I think while we don't have a lot of leverage, I think what we and the Europeans do is important as well. If we basically send a signal that we don't care, then the Ukrainians are going to take that as a signal that they can do what they want.
There are also, if I may, there are a few
Sure.
economic milestones in the very near future, really. One is how the gas renegotiation is handled with Russia and what the outcome is. Another is whether an IMF program can be resuscitated, and so far it's still in suspense. Ukraine has some major credit lines to be renegotiated, including with Russian banks. those are up in the air. The result of those issues will have a huge impact on Ukraine in 2012. And the kind of financial pressure the country may come under.
In a previous life, Mark, you were a White House advisor. Okay. So if you were advising today, what's the best thing, the most constructive thing the United States can do in regards to Ukraine?
Well, at the risk of sounding cliched, I'd say engagement is crucial. I believe that our biggest risk lies in lack of communication, one, we lose the ability to influence thinking and decision-making if we don't engage, and that means opening all hailing frequencies, highest levels of government at the mid-levels. I know we have many dedicated diplomats trying to do that. We have a great ambassador in Ukraine. We need as much high-level attention as possible to the country. If Ukraine slips into the shadows, into the twilight zone, that's where I begin to worry most about its own decisions and its relationship with the West.
Time for a quick final thought, Blair, in this regard, and that has the U.S. in some ways, right after the fall, 20 years ago, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of talk about an important role that the United States and the rest of the world had to play. Have we just become complacent and moved on to other matters?
I think we've moved on to other matters, and I think the region has evolved in a way that makes us less important than we were. And I think our influence, I think the Europeans still have considerable influence over Ukraine. I'm not sure how much influence we have at this point.
The limits of U.S. power are part of the story.
That's right.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for a very thoughtful and insightful discussion. Very useful. Appreciate it. Mm-hmm. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.